makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Iran says the head of its armed forces and 6 of its nuclear scientists have been killed in a wave of Israeli airstrikes. Israel says 200 warplanes hit 100 targets in Iran with the aim of preventing it from being able to make a nuclear weapon. Israel says Iran has responded by launching more than 100 drones. The Israeli prime minister says its attacks on Iran will continue.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
Well, to talk about the markets, but also the geopolitical strategy behind it, we're joined by Hugh Gimber, global market strategist at JPMorgan Asset Management, plus Ross Matheson, our EMEA news director, and Dal Williams from our Jerusalem bureau. So thank you all for joining us. Dan, let's start off with you. I mean, you're here by chance, and this is happening at a time where actually we thought we'd heard from President Trump that no attack was imminent.
Well, there was some nuance in those statements. President Trump is not always consistent, and we may have actually seen a smokescreen being sent up by the Americans, by the Israelis, a sense that something might be imminent, might not be imminent. Keep in mind that we've been discussing a potential Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities like this going back almost 20 years. So it appears that those threats were sincere. They've now been carried out, but it's also quite possible that the Iranians were lulled, their defenses were dropped by the idea that there was ongoing diplomacy and that the Americans might have blocked the Israelis on this path.
Ross, why now? Was it an imminent danger? Was it a danger that actually Israel just thought that they could handle, or did they seize an opportunity?
Well, it seems to be a bit of everything, really. I mean, to Dan's point, obviously they were coordinating with the US because there were another round of US-Iran talks due to start on Sunday in Oman, with a very big question mark, obviously, over those continuing. But the question is, why now? Israel obviously made a decision. You can see that from the comments from Benjamin Netanyahu, that he felt that Israel had to act at this point. Perhaps they were concerned about the trajectory of those talks. The US was saying they didn't really seem to be going anywhere. And the US has warned also, if those talks fell apart, that there was a cause for action against Iran to try and slow its efforts towards a nuclear weapon. And so obviously there was an understanding about that. Is the US potentially happy about this action? Not necessarily. Obviously they knew about it. They didn't block it. But there isn't a massive amount of public endorsement for it because Donald Trump, above all, does not want a kick-up in instability in the region. He doesn't want a full-throated war in the region. And so those conversations behind the scenes would probably have been very interesting, to say the least.
Well, I mean, actually, it was one of his campaign promises, right, that the U.S. would stop having adventures in the Middle East.
Well, that's right. And he was just in the Middle East only a few weeks ago, where he was talking really heavily about the prospects for growth in the region. So he's talking about economic ties, trade, investment, business opportunities, including for US companies. And to have that develop, you really need a sense of political stability. You don't need a war that's escalating directly between Iran and Israel. He wants normalizations of ties. He wants trade relationships between countries. And again, he wants US business to thrive in the region. And that's not an environment that's possible right now. So this goes against, again, what Donald Trump has been pushing for: ceasefire in Gaza and some kind of understanding, at least, about the conflict between Iran and Israel.
Hugh, so risk assets are falling. Safe havens like government bonds and gold, of course, are rising. But it's really mainly being played out through crude oil because there's a concern that some facilities will be hit.
Yeah, and I think the oil move is the key here, because for me, when you look at a geopolitical issue, it matters for markets when it moves economics. And you're in an environment where we've already seen probably all of the good news now on US inflation behind us. We were already anticipating that inflation was going to be picking up through the second half of the year. A big spike in oil prices obviously makes that more complicated. And you look at this through the lens of monetary policy at a time where inflation is low and where consumption is fragile. an oil shock is just a consumption hit. You can ease policy against that backdrop. But I think the reason bond yields aren't falling further this morning is because investors are rightly looking at this and saying, actually, the key implication here is inflation, and therefore it's going to be difficult for the Fed to ease, and you're just going to have to let this pass through slow consumption, but without rates being able to come down.
Yeah, but also, I guess, Hugh, there's spare capacity, right, from OPEC Plus members. At the end of the day, unless something happens in Saudi Arabia and will stand the risk of escalation in this, it seems that they could still put extra barrels on the market quite quickly.
That's right. And let's be clear, Iran is a relatively small player in global oil markets. It's the Strait of Hormuz that's critical. I think that's going to be the key issue over the coming days. Do you continue to see oil leaving the Middle Eastern states broadly and entering the global market? Because provided that happens, OPEC has spare capacity and you can manage this type of oil shock. And we should be clear, it is not in anyone's interest to close the Strait of Hormuz. Think about where Iranian oil goes, primarily China as the overwhelming buyer. So if they were to decide that actually they wanted to cause more of a blockage in the system here, you would antagonize one of your closest remaining allies.
Dan, we're just getting some breaking news. So the UN nuclear watchdog is saying they're deeply concerned over the Israeli strike. The IAEA calls on Israel and Iran to exercise maximum restraint. So for the moment, basically, none of the nuclear, I mean, they were very close to the nuclear, not reactors, but nuclear capabilities of Iran, but nothing's been touched.
Well, it would also seem it's worth the uranium nuclear program, whether it's civilian or military, is based on uranium enrichment. That's a different track.
Right.
To a plutonium reactor, the risk of irradiation of leaks is far greater. In the case of a reactor, that's not quite relevant here. I suspect what they're most worried about is the breach of the idea of diplomatic regulations and norms around nuclear policy, around discussing potential nuclear breaches, and also what Iran's been hinting at, that it could use this as a pretext or a reason, depending who you ask, to officially break out and pursue an open military nuclear program, arguing that it's necessary for its self-defense.
Yeah, so as far as we know, again, explosions were heard across Tehran and Natanz, and that's, one of Iran's key nuclear sites. What happens from now, Dan? I mean, I guess the risk of escalation, and as you say, of retaliation and full-out war in the Middle East is pretty significant.
Well, I think there are a few factors here. You alluded to the initial retaliation. It appears to be limited right now to a swarm of drones that would have been largely intercepted by Israel away from Israel's borders. The big question is, did Israel have help in those interceptions by allies, which would signal they're ready to pitch in, if not offensively, then defensively? Also, if Iran does a huge review, their military system has been decapitated. It would appear Israel sees this as a large-scale move against the nuclear and missile programs. So far, it's not touching the lifeblood oil sector. It's not touching the political echelon there. It's leaving some space for further retaliation. This may be a place where actually it's Iran that steps back rather than the Israelis.
Dan, we also spoke to the former Israel Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Here he is.
How can this be called warmongering when it was Iran who shot twice in two different attacks, hundreds of rockets at Israel? As I said, I'm opposition of Mr. Netanyahu, but on this, there's no left and right. We all support this action because it's going to save millions of lives and save the Middle East from a horrible nuclear nightmare.
Dan, I guess also the attack has raised questions about Trump's ability, frankly, to influence an ally like Netanyahu. Is this the bigger question?
There's a big question, I think, as to what the discussions were behind the scenes. The Americans knew about this at least 2 days in advance. There were drawdowns in Iraq of U.S. Diplomatic personnel elsewhere in the Middle East. That would suggest they knew about it. Presumably, they could have laid down the law and insisted, perhaps even issued threats to the Israelis to stand down. That apparently did not happen. Even were it to have happened, this is a matter of existential interest to Israel, not just in terms of Netanyahu's personal legacy. There is a consensus, while Israelis aren't necessarily daily thinking about Iran, there is a consensus that Israel created in part as a result or as a safeguard against another Holocaust. The Iranians are very open in wanting to see Israel destroyed. A nuclear bomb in Iranian hands would very much change the equation. I don't think Israelis, with all respect to Trump, would take or heed an American request to stand down.
Yeah. So what happens? I mean, from the U.S. side, Ross, how do they handle this?
Well, that's going to be the key question. I mean, as Dan's saying, this is really important for Israel, both for Benjamin Netanyahu, probably personally, because he has been under pressure again, and this may help him at home. But you're seeing the reaction, like across Israel, there's probably going to be widespread support for these strikes on Iran and possibly further action against Iran. The question is, what can the US, what can Europe, what can the UK and other countries do about it? Is it working with other countries in the region, some of the Gulf states, to try and de-escalate? But the ball, in a way, seems to be in Iran's court. You know, as Dan was saying, it's really the calibration of the response from Iran. We've seen in some of the previous tit-for-tats that Iran's actually taken quite a while to work out how to respond. I mean, this drone swarm today was fairly small fry. If they're going to do a broader retaliation, that they're taking their time. Like even this kind of higher level attack on their nuclear sites, on other sites, and taking out some of the senior military leadership, that's a pickup for Iran, but they may pause a bit to work out how to retaliate, because even Iran knows that it can be quite self-destructive to do something very big against Israel. I mean, Iran's proxies have been weakened in the region, Iran itself arguably isolated, and so it's got to really work out here the calibration of its response. So really it's going to be key to see what they do, because that will inform what happens after that with other countries again.
Hugh, I mean, when you look at, gold is probably the safe haven par excellence, but again, what is the market really worried about? Because it's not only about oil, it's this general risk-off mood.
Yeah, and I mean, let's put this in the context of the trade discussions as well that have been dominating all the way through this year. We're only 20-odd days away from a July the 9th deadline that now looks to be pushing right, because this has to absorb all political energy over the next days, weeks, however long this lasts. And that means more uncertainty. That means you're still unclear about where the economy is headed. You slot companies and consumers even further into the wait-and-see mode that they've already found themselves. That's a key drag on growth in the second half of the year. And so I think it's understandable if you're unsure about buying treasuries because you worry about the inflationary impacts. Gold is a key beneficiary. And we also know the dollar is coming under pressure this year for other reasons. So it's not seeing the same kind of safe haven demand that you typically expect in this environment. Gold is the first place people are looking.
I know it's impossible to say, but will it be short-lived? I mean, geopolitical, escalations have largely been overlooked by the market, unless it's something in creeks they just don't know how to trade it. Yeah,
I mean, the question you can kind of answer with another question, frankly, which is where does the escalation go? I think the key issue we need to properly understand here, what is the outlook for global oil supply over the next 6, 12, 18 months? Because if this escalation continues between Iran and Israel, but you're not significantly impacting the global oil market, then yes, the market reaction can be short-lived. But if we're looking at $80, $90, $100 a barrel on Brent for 6, 12 months, that is a global market issue because that is a global economic issue. And I come back to that point. Geopolitics matters for markets when it changes the economic picture.
Dan, who have we heard from? I think we probably still have to hear from Saudi Arabia, Jordania. I mean, are there any key, voices in the Middle East that we need to really watch out for?
Well, we've heard from Jordan saying that its airspace would not be used and has not been used to assist Israel. That appears hard to reconcile with the non-arrival of many of these drones that would have been overflying Jordan on the way to Israel. It appears there was some action in Jordanian skies to stop them, as well as Syrian skies. I think there will be a lip service given to neutrality, staying out of this. I think they'll also be looking at the results. I don't think there'll be any tears shed if this ends up taking the Iranian nuclear program out of the picture for a number of months or years. Though again, if Iranian escalation, I think the US daylight that you mentioned is aimed also at shielding US assets against Iranian retaliation. If there is Iranian retaliation beyond directly at Israel, the calculations may be different, the statements may be more sincere.
All right, thank you so much, all of you, of course, for joining us to get us started on this big news day. Hugh Gimber from JPMorgan Asset Management, Rosalind Matheson, and Dan Williams. Coming up, continuing coverage of Israel's attacks on Iran and Tehran's response. We'll ask what this means for global geopolitics amid fears of a wider war. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Let's recap this morning's developing story out of the Middle East. And Iran says the head of its armed forces and 6 of its nuclear scientists have been killed in a wave of Israeli airstrikes. Israel says 200 warplanes hit 100 targets in Iran with the aim of preventing it from being able to make a nuclear weapon. Israel says Iran has responded by launching more than 100 drones, while oil has surged, while European stocks and U.S. futures are lower. Now, for more on what this means for markets, we're joined by Phoenix Kalen, Global Head of Emerging Markets Research at Societe Generale. Also with us, Julien Barnes-Dacey, Middle East and North Africa Program Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So thank you both for joining us. Julien, maybe let's start off with you to see what the next steps will be. When will we have a clear idea of how much further this escalates?
Sure. Good morning. Well, I think the real question is obviously the nature of the Iranian response. Iran has promised a response. We've seen drone attacks, but frankly, I think that's quite insignificant. The real question is, will Iran launch a barrage of ballistic missile attacks on Israel? We saw that last October. A number of missiles got through Israeli defense systems. And I think if Iran is serious about a response to these attacks, it will come in that area, in the area of ballistic missiles. Drones were symbolic, but they were always going to be meaningless. Ballistic missiles, particularly if they were en masse and moved quickly, I think could cause serious damage for Israel and will absolutely escalate the situation further.
When do we do the? I mean, if you're in Iran, sitting in Iran right now, what would you be thinking? As again, the Ayatollah, they're saying if this gets escalated, they don't really have support from that many people in the region.
Iran is in an incredibly weak position here. Israel has decimated its military leadership and capabilities. Iran has lost all its regional deterrence capabilities. But Iran now feels that if it doesn't respond, it will be even weaker, opening the door to further attacks and perhaps even a regime change effort. But if it does respond, you're likely to see further attacks and escalation from the Israeli side as well. So I think Iran is to a certain extent cornered here. They feel they have no response but to respond. I think the question is, can they do that in a fashion that is calibrated, that tries to contain the situation? Or do they feel at this stage that all bets are off and that unless they go fast and hard, that actually Israel will come for regime change next?
Yeah, and Phoenix, this is definitely playing out on the markets, and this is mainly through the oil market because it's much more tangible and immediate concern. But what happens to the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, 20% of global oil flows go through there. And we've never actually seen a disruption for any extended period of time in that strait. If we do see disruption for even a week, that can lead to $10 per barrel higher in oil prices. So it's the focus of the markets at this point.
I mean, do they look through it in a couple of days or weeks, or does it really depend on what happens on the ground?
So I think it's really about waiting to see what is Iran's response to this, how moderate or how high it might be, and what kind of tenor it takes in terms of escalating this fight further. So I think in that interim of time, we will see choppy prices, lots of volatility in the oil markets, but it won't price to kind of a significant extent until we see what kind of reaction comes out of Iran.
I mean, Julien, we're really, trying to wait and see what the U.S. does next. I mean, the U.S. had said that they didn't want to get involved in the Middle East too much. Does this just drop President Trump fully back in?
Well, look, I think it's incredibly hard to imagine that this happened without some form of American acquiescence or a green light. I think it's clear that Trump does not want to get pulled back into a regional war. But I think at the same time, things are obviously spiraling out of control now, and it's incredibly hard to predict what happens next. It may well be that the Iranians initially try to target Israel in a more direct and limited fashion, but clearly, if that situation continues to escalate, then U.S. backing for Israel is likely to come into play. The Iranians could respond by targeting U.S. regional bases, and of course, the wider this goes in terms of a regional conflict, the more likelihood that Iran then looks to target oil outflows, energy supplies, to impose a wider hit on the global economy. I mean, I think in the first instance, Iran is going to try and safeguard its improving relations with the GCC Arab states. It isn't going to go after them. But if we see this wider escalation, if we see this turn into a broader regional war, then Iran will see the oil card as something that it can play.
But Julien, why now? So it's been, pretty clear that there were escalating tensions between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. But it seems that, I don't know whether Israel took the chance because they thought it was now or never, or whether they just saw a very weakened Iran or a weakened U.S.
Well, look, I think that Netanyahu has clearly been worried by the ongoing direct talks between Iran and the US about the nuclear track. The US and Iran were meant to meet for a 6th round of talks in Oman this weekend. That has now been collapsed because of the Israeli strikes, and I think that was clearly an intent. Israel wanted to torpedo those negotiations because they do not believe in a negotiated track. I think there may be a certain extent to which the Americans and the Trump administration were willing to allow this to happen to try and put more leverage on the Iranians, to put more pressure on the Iranians to come to the negotiating table, to make the kind of compromises that Tehran has not been willing to make thus far. But I think there's a big danger that really misreads Iranian strategic calculations. I find it very hard to imagine that the Iranian response to military strikes will be to make more concessions. And if anything, this will accelerate their desire to weaponize their nuclear program, because they will see that as the only safeguard to protecting themselves. And so then you have a race against time. Can the Israelis move militarily fast and deep enough to prevent that, or do we see the Iranians making swift progress with a nuclear program as their only means of trying to prevent ongoing military attacks within their soil?
But if that happens, when we talk about escalation, what kind of escalation are we talking about? Full-blown war in the Middle East?
I think in the first instance, you have a Iranian potentially ballistic missile response on Israel to think about. Israel has itself said that this is the beginning of a multi-day military campaign on Iran. Let's see what happens over the coming hours and days. Israel could continue to strike. If Iran strikes with ballistic missiles against Israel, you can expect a much more deadly, widespread, and possibly involving direct U.S. involvement military campaign against Iran that could potentially move towards regime change ambitions. You could see Iranian attacks on U.S. military bases across the region, oil supplies, and so on and so forth. So this could spiral and escalate very quickly unless the Iranians make a decision to suck this up, that they decide that this is not in their interest to engage in a wider campaign and only pursue a limited symbolic response.
And Phoenix, if you're head of emerging markets will probably suffer more than some of the others.
Yes, I think that in the historical context, it won't suffer as much as it would have in the past in terms of kind of the external vulnerabilities being reduced, the inflation profiles being much more contained now, and central banks having a much tighter grip on what they can do in terms of policy response. I think, yes, for some of the countries that are exposed to higher oil prices, they will get hurt for sure. And then in terms of the risk-off sentiment, that will have an impact and feed through to especially the more sensitive currencies like Rand, like Max, like Hungary, like Korea.
Gold is going up, like the safe haven par excellence. How does that impact emerging markets?
Well, so that's going to be quite beneficial for some of the countries that do produce gold. So South African Rand, to some extent, gets a little bit of offset from there, as opposed to kind of its risk sensitiveness. And then I think in terms of like the broader diversification question as well, that tends to lead into more flows into gold, but also flows outside of the U.S., flows into euro, flows into kind of the more Eurocentric currencies as well.
Okay, thank you both for joining us. Phoenix Kalen there from Societe Generale and Julien Barnes-Dacey of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on Israel, on Iran, on markets. I'm looking at gold. It's up. The key Iranian nuclear site seems to be showing no sign of breach. So that's according to the IAEA. We'll have plenty more on that next. And this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Israel launches airstrikes on Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and warns more action will come. Tehran retaliates, sending drones towards Israel. Oil surges the most in more than 3 years. Stocks slide and haven assets rise on fears of a wider war. Plus, investigators search for clues in the wreckage of the Air India flight that crashed after takeoff, killing all but one of the 242 people aboard. So let's return to our top story. And Iran says the head of its armed forces and 6 of its nuclear scientists have been killed in a wave of Israeli airstrikes. Well, Israel says 200 warplanes hit 100 targets in Iran with the aim of preventing it from being able to make a nuclear weapon. Israel says Iran has responded by launching more than 100 drones. Well, oil spiking on the news of the attacks, at some point surging as much as 13% before pairing gains. Let's get the details with our Will Kennedy, who oversees all of our commodities coverage. So first of all, Will, what is the oil market actually monitoring and watching out for now?
It's all about how it escalates from here. Clearly, these attacks have not taken any oil out of the market, but there are huge risks ahead depending on how Iran responds. Clearly, people focus about the fact that Iran has a lot of influence over the Strait of Hormuz. It's now a waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, out of which a third of global oil supplies come, and whether they will respond or escalate by trying to attack or interfere with shipping coming through Hormuz is going to be a key question for the market from here on in. Also, whether there'll be more sanctions on Iranian oil. They've increased production a lot in recent years, and they're bringing more than 1 million barrels a day to the market. Will that oil need to be replaced? So there's a lot for traders to think about.
But, how should we, again, digest some of these developments in light of the bigger situation on the oil market?
Yep. I mean, the bigger situation is that obviously OPEC has been putting a lot of oil back into the market, and prices were down over the year because of that. But now we're well above $70 a barrel, which shows the nervousness in the market. And actually, the market is fairly well balanced right now, that there has been a market for that extra OPEC crude. I think one thing that may cap gains from here is that OPEC still has a lot of oil that it can bring back into the market if it needs to. We'd already reported that Saudi Arabia was thinking about further increases at its next meeting. It has a couple more million barrels of spare capacity. The UAE has a lot of spare capacity. So in situations where this escalates, there's a lot that the UAE and Saudi Arabia can do to keep the market well supplied and keep a lid on prices if they can get their oil out of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, so again, some people are saying, look, we could go to $120, right? As you were saying, if there are disruptions of shipping, which we saw on that graphic, through the Strait of Hormuz. But what happens if we have just a protracted Middle Eastern conflict? That nothing escalates, but it also doesn't de-escalate?
That's a really good question. The scenario where we've got a lot of conflict, but we're still getting oil out, I think it will have an impact on prices. Clearly, the shipping market matters here. Even if the strait is open, if shipping's being attacked, if tanker owners are reluctant to go into the Persian Gulf, if they're charging more money, that can all have an impact on oil prices. As I say, one key risk is that after these events that sanctions snap back, because we had this outside the Israeli attack. Obviously, the IAEA said that the Iranians are in breach of their obligations under the nuclear accord, so sanctions may snap back. So there are other things that may take oil out of the market at the margin and make it more difficult to ship oil that may support prices outside the sort of doomsday scenario, the $100 plus scenario that people are mapping out for a full closure of the Gulf of Strait of Hormuz.
Well, what's happening to the other commodities? Again, linked to oil, but there's less of an immediate effect.
There are two other things I would mention. Gold, obviously, is up today. It's had a very good run this year, as we know. It's up today, back close to a record. And that's, of course, because in times of uncertainty and upheaval, people turn to gold as a haven. And then finally, I think people should watch gas markets, as well as a lot of oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. Qatar is a huge gas supplier through LNG tankers. And in a scenario where we did see shipping disrupted, that could have a big impact on global gas markets at a time where summer demand is quite high.
Yeah, I mean, oil options, I mean, then there's the quirks of the markets, right, that you were kind of telling us. Are the next 24 or 48 hours crucial to understand actually the escalation? And could we see a big pop either way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're a trader, you want to position yourself going into the weekend so that, Monday morning doesn't look ugly. So, I mean, I think we have seen people buy protection against worst-case scenarios by buying out-of-the-money call options just to give them some protection in case this really does spiral out of control.
Well, thank you so much for a terrific briefing, of course, on the oil markets and everything that we've seen over the last 12 hours. He is Will Kennedy, and he's in charge of all of our oil coverage. Now, let's get the views of Richard Dalton, who was the UK's ambassador to Iran between 2002 and 2006. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. When you look at what happened over the last 12 to 14 hours, how do you think Iran will retaliate?
They will clearly use their missiles and drone force initially against Israel. If there is any suspicion that the United States is aiding and abetting Israeli actions against Iran in the next few days, then I would expect Iran to retaliate against American bases as well.
But Ambassador, how aggressive? Again, they'll retaliate in a very aggressive manner. I know there was fighting talk and saying, look at what happened to us. This is why we need nuclear on our side. Or do you think they'll have to temper it because Iran is weakened and they don't seem to have many allies in the region?
Iran has been weakened, and I think this is one reason why Netanyahu has taken this opportunity to launch his long-gestated, long-wished-for plan to attack Iran. Another reason, of course, is that in the United States there's a weak president distracted by internal affairs, 100% committed ideologically to Israel. But, of course, Iranian retaliation will go beyond the military sphere. Like other states, they'll use all means of power that they are capable of deploying. And I would expect them to consider withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This has been suggested by Iranian parliamentarians on many occasions. And also, if pushed further, they might well intervene against international oil trade. So what Israel has done in launching an illegal act of aggression against Iran without the necessary justification for a preemptive attack, we are starting a process which at the moment is out of control.
And Ambassador, I mean, this is also 2 days before the next round of talks between Iran and the U.S. It seems like it was in disregard of U.S. policy, or certainly what Donald Trump was openly saying he wanted. Does the U.S. now get fully sucked into this conflict?
It might do. It depends on the nature of Israel's attacks on Iran and how serious they are. And it depends on the choices that Iran makes about retaliation. It's not the first time that Israel has used military action to preempt diplomacy. You would recall that it was at Israeli urging that President Trump withdrew the United States and destroyed the program of action negotiated and agreed in 2015 and 2016, which severely limited and monitored Iran's nuclear program. Indeed, it's President Trump's actions in his first term that have launched us into this unpredictable cycle of attack and retaliation. The international community has also got a large part to play in this because of its excessive indulgence of Israeli aggressive actions, however savage their actions in Gaza have been, for example, and by granting Israel immunity from the normal rules of international law and international humanitarian law. Moreover, the inhibition against aggression between states was gravely weakened by the United States and the United Kingdom in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. So we're seeing a very dark picture.
We are seeing a dark picture. What are the chances, given you were British ambassador to Iran, what are the options for Iran right now? So if you look at some of the choke points for oil and container trade, we're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz. There's also the Red Sea. How much is that at risk? Because shipping companies, have been advised to take extra precautions. But is this one way that Iran could retaliate and inflict also more global pain?
Undoubtedly. But as I said, it depends on the degree of pain which they are experiencing and their own estimates, which of course no one is privy to, about their capacity to sustain a longer war, and a longer war in which other parties like the United States might become involved. But their position has always been that if they are denied the ability to export their oil through the Straits of Hormuz, then no one else will be allowed to export oil through the Straits of Hormuz. So I expect them to show some restraint at the outset. But if this conflict is prolonged, then the risks of disruption to the international oil trade and of a further more serious spike in prices will remain.
Of course, a reminder, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said the U.S. is not involved in the strikes against Iran. But, Ambassador, who is there left to actually mediate this? I don't know whether China needs to play a role. I don't know whether the EU needs to get involved. But is there someone that you would look to?
The United States has sidelined its previous partners in this international negotiation because it didn't like their policies. And moreover, there's a war in Europe involving Russia, and the United States is at loggerheads with China. But this was a strategic mistake, because to obtain the kind of limitations through diplomacy on which the United States and Israel wish to rely for the security of the region, it's necessary to bring all states with influence in Tehran to the table. Now, the European countries have zero influence. The Chinese and Russians have substantial influence. So, yes, if the President Trump should wish to turn to a renewed effort to diplomacy, he should bring in those countries who have a strategic relationship with Tehran, chiefly Russia and China.
Ambassador, what is, if you were the U.S. right now, right, the Trump administration, who would you call? Would you call, Netanyahu? Would you try and reach someone else to make sure that this doesn't escalate and start a war that from the start, even in his campaign, Donald Trump had said he did not want to get involved in?
Well, the United States clearly has almost no influence in Tel Aviv, given that it is unwilling to use the power that it does have over Israel's military and Israel's economy. We are seeing now the long anticipated fruits of the policy of 100% endorsement of a state which is capable of acting in a rogue manner, contrary to the interests in Middle East peace and security of neighboring countries, of regional countries, and indeed of Europe and the United States. So I would expect there to be conversations between the United States and Tel Aviv in due course, but I don't think we should expect early results.
All right, Ambassador, thanks so much for your time. Richard Dalton there, the former British ambassador to Iran. Now to the other big story of the day. It's reported that one of the black boxes located at the rear of the crashed Air India plane in Ahmedabad has been recovered. Now, the London-bound Boeing 787 Dreamliner crashed shortly after takeoff, killing all but one of the 242 people on board. We're joined by Kate Duffy, who covers global aviation for Bloomberg. Kate, I mean, it's difficult actually to continue, to see the way forward in this, but what are we learning about the possible causes of the crashes?
That is still really unknown. As you say, we've recovered one of the two black boxes that were on board the 787, but as it always happens with these kind of air accidents, it takes a long time to figure out what actually happened and what caused it. And from what we know, we're looking at the footage. Experts have looked at the footage, and they've seen that the flaps and also the landing gear are not potentially in places where they should be. There are other speculations flying around, but until we find out and get that critical information from the black box, then it's still sort of really unknown as to why it crashed.
Kate, the crash also raises new demands on the Boeing chief executive, Kelly Ortberg.
It absolutely does. And he was expected to be at the Paris Air Show, something which our team is going to over the weekend. We were set to interview him, but that is obviously on hold. He's cancelled his plans to go. All of his attention is now purely focused on this crash and just the response to it, and all the people affected by it. And just to find out really what has happened. Boeing, they're going through this turnaround at the moment. A lot of pressure is on their manufacturing and quality production, especially after the 737 accident. So all eyes are now on the 787 as to what happened.
Yeah, and again, it's impossible to speculate. We should absolutely not, even try and think about what could happen. But is it one of the first crashes which involves this type of plane?
It is, yes, and that's what's so shocking about it. Up until now, it had a completely clear safety record, but now we're trying to find out, was it the plane? Was it an error? Those are all the questions that need to be answered.
Kate, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Kate Duffy there with the very latest on this Air India crash investigation. Coming up, world leaders call for de-escalation after Israel's attacks on Iran. We'll have more on the reaction next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now let's recap the morning development story out of the Middle East. Iran says the head of its armed forces and 6 of its nuclear scientists have been killed in a wave of Israeli airstrikes. Now, Israel says 200 warplanes hit 100 targets in Iran with the aim of preventing it from being able to make a nuclear weapon. Well, Israel says Iran has responded by launching more than 100 drones. Oil surging, European stocks and U.S. futures are lower. Well, let's bring in our Middle East anchor, Jumana Barsecher. We're lucky to have her in London, and Jonathan Tyrone, who covers atomic diplomacy for Bloomberg. Jonathan, let's start off with you. Now, the UN nuclear watchdog says they're deeply concerned over the Israeli strikes. What are they exactly worried about?
Well, they're worried about, first and foremost right now, radiological incidents. If Israel is able to penetrate the containment of the sites at Fordo, at Natanz, then you're potentially releasing radioactive material, that is enriched uranium, into the atmosphere that can spread. Therefore, in his first detailed readout, IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi urged maximum restraint, and he even offered to go back to Tehran, to the region, to try to broker some kind of compromise.
Yeah, and Jumana, I mean, the timing of this actually feels quite significant because the Trump administration, I mean, Donald Trump, did not want to be part of this war. I don't know whether they get sucked in, but had also said yesterday that he didn't think an attack was imminent.
Yeah, that is correct. And he definitely posted about it the day before, saying that they were still intent on a diplomatic resolution. Of course, events have sort of overtaken all of that and superseded. Now the Iran side saying that they don't want to engage in the 6th round of U.S.-Iran nuclear discussions that were set to take place this Sunday. And certainly there have been a couple of tracks going on here. You have the U.S. track trying to push forward with these discussions, but obviously meeting some resistance, especially around that red line of uranium enrichment, with Iran saying that it is a no-go zone for them to agree to 0 levels of enrichment, whereas the U.S. and Israel have wanted 0 levels of enrichment. And the U.S. has sort of changed their tune as the discussions took place. But what became apparent in the past week is that Iran were looking to first start defying, because on Thursday they announced a new nuclear enrichment facility, and we could talk about it with Jonathan. And 2, the IAEA put out a report saying that Iran had essentially started breaking the constraints and the parameters that the IAEA had set about vis-a-vis the monitoring and the enrichment levels that were required. And so Iran were testing the waters. As the Israeli Prime Minister has been saying for weeks, if not months, that they would not hesitate to go down the military escalation route. And that is exactly what happened. But if you look at the damage that's sustained so far, and Jonathan can speak to this, there has been some level of damage inflicted on these nuclear facilities, but they're not fully dismantled yet. And that is why the Israeli Prime Minister is saying that they will continue until they are guaranteed that Iran cannot enrich uranium any further.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I mean, it's really interesting that the timing is, of course, 2 days before the U.S. and, Iran were speaking about actually nuclear capabilities.
Yeah, look, this is setting in motion a very dismal set of diplomatic steps. A couple of days ago in the United Nations Security Council, Iran's UN envoy warned that this kind of strike would also set into motion a withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, what that does in practice is remove eyes on the ground in Iran, because let's not forget here, there are 2 separate tracks in terms of Iran's cooperation. It's true that they were found in non-compliance with their IAEA safeguards agreement a couple of days ago. But that's about decades-old nuclear material that was discovered at, undeclared sites. The more important issue right now is the vast accumulation of highly enriched uranium. That material is under international safeguards. There are literally IAEA monitors on the ground in Iran today. They keep track of that material 2-gram levels under the NPT, which is the Bedrock Arms Control Agreement. If Iran triggers its right to withdraw from that treaty, then you're putting IAEA inspections in play, and you're suddenly adding a new level of opacity and less understanding to where and what Iran is doing. And let me just finally say, Iran already warned in a diplomatic note circulated a couple of weeks ago that it was prepared to take special measures in the event of an Israeli strike, to actually withdraw its highly enriched uranium from IAEA seal and bring it to a secure location where we do not know where it resides. So, this strike is only the first in a step in what will be a very difficult, very challenging effort to, stop through kinetic means a enrichment program.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I mean, one of the things that people are asking is that it doesn't seem like there was an imminent threat, but maybe more of an opportunity for Israel to do something at this moment in time. Just breaking news in the last couple of minutes, Middle Eastern countries have also closed airspace after this airstrike, and so that has led to the closure of airspace in Israel, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Now, we're also joined by Lynette Nusbacher, chair of Nusbacher and Associates, a former British Army intelligence officer who is part of the team that created 2 of the UK's national security strategies. Thank you for joining us. Lynette, when you look at where this goes, I don't know whether it's the next 48 to 72 hours are extremely critical as we wait to see how violently Iran responds.
Iran has already, of course, volleyed off a load of UAVs, a load of drones to try to retaliate against Israeli action. But Iran has always made it clear that they will respond to anything at a time and place of their choosing. And any time the Iranian leadership has been directly attacked, as they have been today, they have always said that they'll retaliate using terrorism, using indirect attack, attacking globally. So the Iranian response doesn't have to be today. It doesn't have to be tomorrow. Iran is going to be under a lot of pressure to put in as intense an attack against the Israelis as possible. They're going to try to use the Houthis to do it. They're going to try to use Hezbollah to do it. And that's because the Israelis have checked a lot of Iran's immediate retaliatory capability.
But Lynette, I mean, if there are 2 choices, right, escalate very quickly and do something to show actually that maybe you're not as weak as people say from the Iranian side, or have a protracted, Middle East conflict that lasts and lasts. I mean, is there an obvious choice for Iran right now?
Francine, we're already in a protracted Middle Eastern conflict that lasts and lasts. It's already a shooting war. So what we're going to see from the Iranians is a calibrated change based on what resources they still have available to them. The war has already gone on for 2 years, and the Iranians will be stretching to see what they can do next. I think that there will be Iranian kinetic attack in the next 72 hours. They'll definitely try. But as we've seen in the last few minutes, they don't necessarily have that intact capability.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Lynette Nusbacher, their chair of Nusbacher and Associates, Jumana Bersace from Bloomberg, and Jonathan Tyrone. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more from Bloomberg Brief. Of course, the main focus will be also on oil future. The curve strengthening due to concerns over Israel's strike on Iran. We're looking at it very closely. Again, just a couple of hours ago, the front-month Brent prices spiking as much as 13%. Time spreads actually rallying. Oil options probably at their most bullish in years, with implied volatility higher. Potential for oil prices to reach $120 a barrel. We heard this on the show if there are disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. This is Bloomberg.